Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Ashley Hodgson, who is an economics professor somewhere in the Central Time Zone, and also the host of the New Enlightenment with Ashley YouTube channel. She's also got an economics channel, and in the New Enlightenment channel, she challenges a lot of the narrative structures and the information structures and the knowledge structures that shape current discourse. In this conversation, we talk a lot about those structures, and I find her to be an incredibly inquisitive mind and very articulate in formulating questions about the concerns that we have with regard to polarization, truth-seeking, and knowledge formation. You can find her via the links below. Also, if you enjoy this content, consider liking, subscribing, and donating. Without further ado, here is Ashley Hodgson. What have you been up to?
Just been writing this morning, so that's always fun.
Oh, really? Oh, nice. You said you're on a sabbatical, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
You're writing like a epic science fiction novel about various economics societies clashing?
Not quite science fiction for this one, but I feel like sometimes there's overlap. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Paradigm
bet.
shifts in economics, governance, and knowledge systems. I feel like when you're trying to be creative with stuff regarding the future, it kind of crosses over a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
You look very Christmassy. I guess it's the
I'm
lights in this
sorry.
sweater.
I wanted a little bit more color, and this is the top of the queue for sweaters, so it might be a little out of season, but hopefully this episode ages well.
Yep. Should we talk about the direction? Because I was thinking, I sent you those three things.
Yeah.
As you might imagine, the thing I'm most nervous about is the first one I listed. And I
Yeah.
do want to talk about it. I've never talked about it publicly. But maybe putting it at the end after we've talked about the other stuff.
So your origin story comes at the end?
Is that
Do we?
okay?
Well, we can do in media res. That's another literary trope.
What's that?
When the story begins in the middle,
Yeah.
and then it
Okay.
goes forwards, and then it goes back, and then it goes forwards again. Kind
I
of
like
thing.
it. I like it.
But yeah. So yeah, I like diving into these things because my brain like gropes, and it does funny or interesting things when it's groping for grounding. You know, like it shoots off these questions that end up doing interesting things.
See, I love that because that's where the creativity comes from. It's sort of like when you're in the moment and you discover things as
Yeah.
you're thinking it through, you're like, wait a second, I had no idea this would go that direction. And I
Yeah.
kind of feel like talking with you, like even thinking about it, I was discovering things. And I'm so curious to hear your perspective because I think there's some parallels, but also different places we've ended up,
Yeah.
which makes things juicy and interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have, and I always do this, I just start.
Yep.
Okay. So you have two different YouTube facing channels, and you also have a professoriate career.
Yes. Yes.
What is the direction outward onto the internet? How did you start doing that? And why did you end up going in two parallel directions? Like you have something more on the meaning side of things and another thing on a more academic, economic, kind of straight-laced, maybe? I don't know what you would describe it as, but there's these two kind of directions that you're going. Why did you need to go in two places?
Yeah. Wow, that was a really well targeted question, honestly. I mean, I've started my channel because I was trying to do something like the flipped classroom, and I noticed I was giving the same lectures over and over, and I was like, okay, I like the interaction with students, so I just want me talking those lectures I always give to go online. And that didn't ultimately work, but it's useful content that my students find helpful. It sort of helps students coming from different places with the content to be able to review it. So that was like my
Yeah.
classic channel.
Okay. Yeah.
And then, yeah, the other channel,
Ashley Classic.
yeah. And that one I just put a couple of videos up and didn't notice for years that they were getting views. And then I noticed that and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So maybe I should lean into this.
Yeah.
The other channel relates more to some of the stuff that started with, the 2017 stuff I want to talk about. at the end. But it took me a long time to figure out like what is my role in the bigger story that's going on with society and these power structures.
Yeah.
And I had to wrestle with, wait a second, there's something going on, and there are places where I feel like I'm not living up to my integrity in certain ways. But I ended up exploring a lot of avenues and found that I'm really like a sweet spot for me is finding communities that are speaking past each other and trying to navigate that place in between them, like figuring out what is the part of what they're saying that's not landing on the other side. And I feel like my other channel was sort of leaning in that direction. It was finding that, but also tying it with how my thinking about economics has evolved. Because I think some of these issues with culture wars and whatnot,
Yeah.
polarization, they're connected with the power structures.
And power structures are expressed through economics?
So economics, I think it's a flavor of a mythology in terms of how our society is structured, like how does our system work?
Yeah.
And it manifests itself differently in different spaces. So like if you look at academic spaces, if you look at the Fed, if you look at like not-for-profits that are deciding where major resources flow and the cost benefit that happens there. And the field of economics kind of manifests itself differently in these different spaces.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that has a huge effect, not just on where resources flow economically, but I think also on the types of mythology that get wrapped up in these power battles.
Power bottles?
Battles.
Battles, okay. Because there's bubbles, bottles, and battles. And bubbles pop and bottles fume and battles rage.
Yes.
Yeah. There's something going on right now in Ohio where there's a town called Springfield, and what we know for certain, there's a lot of mythology going on, a lot of rumors going on about the behavior of these immigrants. But the fact is that there was 40 or 50,000 residents in Springfield, and over the course of very few years, 20,000 Haitian refugees were imported into this town. And it looks to be the case that NGOs, non-government operations, whatever, organizations, but they're operations, which aren't non-government, because they're connected to the power structure, are facilitating a lot of shaping of society. And they're doing it divorced from any sort of accountability with regard to electoral processes, and also limited accountability in the fact that we don't even know where their funding's coming from, how they're getting it. And there's this whole thing that some people call the deep state, right? This behemoth, this managerial behemoth that is doing a lot of moving and shaking and deciding the actual course of our country and our society, while the culture war rages on a very surface level about, ideals and stuff. But on the ground, it seems like NGOs have taken the place of where churches might have operated. I don't know. I want to bust into that because it seems to me I'm really worried, or it just makes me really anxious that NGOs have so much power in our system. It's a total aside, but I think it does lead into what we're talking about, because it is basically the activist class on the ground, right? What are your thoughts on that? And we can make that more solid of a question if you just start popping off, if you don't mind.
I love it. I had no idea where you're going to go. Yeah, I think one of the elements of trouble in this conversation is that there ends up being this language where the way one group will conceptualize something wraps itself around a mythology, and that might include something like the deep state, or it might include like people's perspective on immigrants. And there's a dynamic with the game theory of how conversation evolves that's not driven by anyone, but such that when one group says something like the deep state or starts talking about immigration or whatnot, one side understands mythology in one way, and there's a
Mhm.
variety of there's diversity within that understanding, so that some people have a really naive and dumb understanding in that group, and other people have a really sophisticated
Yeah.
understanding, and most people are in the middle.
Yeah.
But then the other group is sort of their understanding of how that's being used is counter to that in a way that is very reactionary against it. And
Mhm.
it ends up pulling that conversation in a way that's completely away from the actual issues. And sometimes both groups actually have a lot in common in terms of how they're experiencing things, in terms of the effect on them. And I know that was kind of theoretical,
Yeah.
but I think that's why, I mean, I'm still trying to figure out my place in this space. I'm curious about your journey to figure out how
Mm.
you fit into it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm trying to speak in a way that doesn't pull in one direction or another, which is really hard because there are so many different
Yeah.
fractures that have that dynamic.
Yeah. Speaking as a erstwhile centrist, you think you're directing traffic, but you're the one getting run over because you're standing in the middle of the road. Some people say fence sitting, where the grass is both green and less green on both sides at once. It's really, really difficult, and I admire the impulse to do that. And one way to avoid having to make a decision in one way or another, or taking a stand on one side or another of any given issue, is to really kind of get down into the roots of things, and to first and foremost always define your terms, because there's so much working on the radical or the root
Mhm.
of how we understand it that can be extrapolated into all this dynamics, all this chaos and game theory and power when it meets power. So if we want to get away from the dynamics of power, we can go back into the roots. So one way we can go is you use the word mythology, not ideology. Why?
Um, Mythology is more embodied, and it involves I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap. I think language doesn't capture things well, so I think some people's usage of ideology maps pretty well onto my use of mythology. But mythology has it's embodied in the sense of there's a ritual around it, there's perceptions of that are kind of halfway historical. Like these are thought experiments sometimes that have maybe a historical context, and maybe some people think it's really historical and some kind of know it's not. But I
Hmm.
I think that maps pretty well onto the space of economics. I think about because a lot of economics is just these thought experiments, but they're mapped onto like situations you might experience in everyday life, and they're used as a way of building up how we understand our system to be working.
Or not
And some of
working?
them work really, yeah, or not working, or not working. And some of them work really well to help understand what's going on, but a lot of them have evolved to create massive misunderstandings of how the system is working.
They've evolved to create that.
Yeah,
They've evolved to obfuscate power or to
yeah,
disrupt understanding.
I think both of those are, yeah.
Okay. And I like the evolutionary mythology or analogy because it at once assumes intention and then also washes its hands of any sort of intention, It's like there's agency, but it's not agency, it's emergent, you know?
Yeah, I don't know about the word emergent. I think the problem here is that these words are getting used in different ways by different people,
Yeah.
which makes it hard to talk about. But I do live
So
in a very ambiguous space. Like I try to maintain the ambiguity, and I think there's a lot of value in some of that.
why?
Because I think
Can you disambiguate your ambiguosity?
um, I think a lot of times where people end up in these wars, it's over facts. They think it's over facts, but it's not
Mm.
over facts. It's over something that's behind the facts. It's like this fact about what something that happened in the world. It's
Yeah.
what is that representative of
Yeah.
in your worldview? Like how
Yeah.
prevalent is things like that? Is this a rising
Yeah.
phenomenon or a falling phenomenon?
Yeah.
And so zooming in to be specific makes it about not what it's actually about. And the conversation, I think, can get lost in that. And it's not that there's never a role for specifics. It's just, I think, the role I am trying to embody it is carefully ambiguous.
Because it allows you to be free with your thought.
No, it's because I think if I look at the landscape of these groups who think the other group is the problem, and a lot of times the way their intuition is acting is against that other group, sort of getting those people to speak in a certain way. What I
Yes.
want for my channel is to identify the high enough level patterns
Okay.
to where both groups
Yes.
could look at the what I'm
Okay.
saying with which is like experimentation with mythology and say,
Yeah.
wait a second, why is that group seeing something here? That doesn't
Okay.
make sense.
Okay.
That's
All
what I'm
right.
trying to do.
All right. Excellent. Okay. Thank you for bringing it back into your channel. Like the the ongoing thought experiment that's encased in your channels,
Yeah.
right? You're trying to do this thing in order to provide a crossroads, perhaps a meeting ground, or even cross-pollination between these groups.
Exactly.
Why is that important? Why is it a value for you for people to understand each other?
Yeah. Because I think the dynamics of the system, it's kind of escalating in terms of this power to the powerful dynamic, and it's chaos and it's scary, and I think a lot of people sense something's wrong.
Yeah.
But and I do believe there can be pathways that most people will be better off if things change in certain ways. And that's going to have to involve building in checks and balances against the power to the powerful dynamic and things like that. But right now, because most people's energy is pointed in the wrong direction, it's pointed at the other instead of at the system structures. We're not having the conversations that would build up the something different that we could move into. And I think the thing that's holding these groups apart is contempt. It's sort of the straw man mythologies of the other, like the other people usually project what do those other people believe? And it's really immoral and stupid what they believe. And as soon as people detect that that group is projecting that onto me, people sort of go into fight or flight mode and it becomes this battle. And I think getting the barriers of contempt to cool off is going to be necessary to actually collaborate enough to make the changes that need to be made, basically.
In the founding of the great country of the United States of America, I think it was Madison that designed a system of checks and balances or competing power structures, which we could go on to a long account of how that isn't actually operating as intended. But within that is just this notion that human nature is, there's a lot of ways we can extrapolate on how he was viewing humans in a certain way. And so he was trying to design a system that would function given certain intuitions or understandings of how human beings operate. With that said, you bring up this conflict theory of conflict, or that people are going to glob into a group and then reinforce that group dynamic by othering or by fighting. Can that be harnessed economically, and can it ever not be the case that human beings act that way? Is that a given from your understanding of humans?
So that's okay. That's two questions.
Oh, good.
Okay.
I didn't know. I wasn't
Maybe
counting.
I'll start with the second, and then hopefully you remember the first.
Okay.
The second, I think human beings generally act that way. but also the system structures channel the way that sort of the groupishness works. Like groups have games they're playing inside the group, which are, oftentimes generous, and it's sort of this dance between people in a group, and they're competing and cooperating. It's beautiful. But then if that group's
Okay.
power gets threatened, they come together to sort of protect the group's game, the internal game. And maybe historically this was tribes that made up the group units. Right now, those group units are oftentimes operating inside the system in some place. Like it could be a university department, it could be a whole field in academia, or a whole not-for-profit network. There's lots of different levels at which that dynamic is going on. And so the system is structuring the way that manifests. And so something that would restructure that, I think, is good. So your question was about human nature. I think we have to be a little bit flexible with our understanding of human nature, just because some human nature comes from our understandings that are sort of built up on concepts we've known our whole lives, and different cultures do have different such concepts. And I don't think we can ever, or we can't know from where we're standing here how much of that is changeable and how much isn't.
Okay.
Did that answer that question?
Yeah. Well, I guess it does kind of answer what I was trying to figure out about you, is that when we concern ourselves with knowledge systems, when we try to think in terms of systems, that leads to its own nest of vipers. A lot of the issues that people have with the systems of thought called communism and fascism, or various variations of that, right? What we typically call fascist would be some sort of ethnocentric purity culture, and what we think of as communist is some sort of hyper-collectivist kind of view of the world where fairness eventually wins over the whole system. But one problem that I have is that when people start to think in those terms, they think in terms of like how society should function. They start thinking in terms of like how society should function. So they no longer see the individual anymore. The individual is completely reduced into an atom, or into a cog in the machine, or something like that. And I think that from my point of view, an ideology tends to treat people or society like a mechanism. And a mythology tends to treat people and society as a story. That's basically how I would define those two things. And I think that human experience actually is more of a story than it is a machine. Though there's really mechanisms here, there, and everywhere. So when you're trying to very carefully like build, what are those things? Scaffolding up to conceptualize these things called systems, and then this total trigger concept for me, change the system. Like, okay, wait, hold on there. Like, I'm more and more conservative as I age, and like I don't know why there's so many fences, and I know that a lot of them are BS. But I know a bunch of other ones are like absolutely necessary, and I watch the people who are erecting all these BS structures tearing down the ones that actually form the basis of functioning society at the same time. I just worry about the project itself of trying to change the system, though I know that the system needs to change, and the system could change itself if you take an evolutionary lens. But then you're looking at these terrible disasters called collapse and rebooting, right?
Yeah. Okay. I want to respond to that. Hold on. Can I write down three? There's 3 points I want to respond to.
Yeah, totally. How many interviews do you do? That's a softball question. Do you do them frequently?
Not too frequently. Okay. I don't know, a couple times a year, maybe.
Oh, wow. Okay.
At the end, you said, collapse. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. The different levels, like you talked about this higher level, there's the individual level, and then there's these intermediate levels. And I think we need to start thinking in terms of fractals, because I think all of the levels need to be in our mind at once. Like when we think about an individual, the individual has multiple desires that are competing in themselves, and those desires have relationships with each other, and sometimes one wins, and there's mood, and it's contextualized in their social relationships. So you can kind of look at the family, and you can look at different
Mm-hmm.
groups they belong to, their workplace group, all the way up to society. And I
Hmm.
mean, I do think the change is going to happen at multiple different levels. It's not going to happen top down. It's not going to happen from the individual up. It's going to happen sometimes in groups, sometimes with individuals who are acting to that'll then work
Yeah.
its way up within groups. And I think one um, thing when people are listening to each other is I think sometimes conservatives will listen to liberals and think liberals are always talking about the whole system. Whereas there are a lot of liberals who think in pluralistic terms about pluralism, different communities with different cultures.
Hmm.
And liberals look at conservatives and they think conservatives are always focused on the individual with a single thing they're trying to accomplish. Whereas a lot of conservatives, they care a lot about the family and the church, and they have these intermediate structures. And that's one area I think that collaboration could happen in terms of uh,
Mm.
there's more overlap than people sometimes realize.
Hmm. I guess there's this chart that is just, I don't know if you're on the social media site that used to be called Twitter, but there's all these discourses that are happening, and it's really fascinating. And I get burnout on it when it gets really sloppy. It gets really sloppy, and then it crystallizes, and there's a lot of energy in a discourse, and or there's a pattern that emerges that is just fascinating to watch. And there was this sociological study on empathy with regard to conservatives and progressives or liberals. And there was this beautiful heat map that shows that conservatives' empathy is clustered around the family and like closer to home, and liberals' empathy is clustered like somewhere between plants and rocks. Like they're really trying to they care more about the world than they care about their own children. And you can see that kind of playing out in on lower level with something as anodyne and yet impassioned as abortion rights, where conservatives' instinct is the baby's the most precious thing in the world, and the liberals' instinct is at once the individual choice is the most important thing in the world, and the whole society or like the world, like climate change. They like the abortion for me, and then climate change is like it's this weird kind of dynamic, and it just pops up over and over and over again. And I'm just seeing this manifest. I forgot where I was going with that, but yes, the what you were talking about conservatives tending towards the particular. I'm of a particular time and a particular place, and how that is made out to be a fascist impulse by the more liberal saying that hearing blood and soil. Like I want to purify my land of anybody that's different than me, and I want carbon copies of myself over and over again. Which, like, you can see how they would see that, and then conservatives' concern with the cosmopolitan, more progressive liberal point of view where we can just live in a big city and everything that is regarded as sacred in a society is boiled down to having kebabs and bulgogi and Mediterranean food and a taco truck. Like it's all my culture is deracinated and turned into different flavors. There's no real actual meaning in anything. It's just humanity is a buffet, and you can just put it all together and reassemble human beings as something that's different than something that started within a family with a particular culture and particular place. So I'm just trying to extrapolate on what we're talking about with that really useful, if blunt, instrument of left and right, conservative, progressive, or conservative, liberal. That was
Well, so
rant.
what you
So,
just said,
okay.
I feel like I I feel like people on the left might object to that characterization.
Okay.
Um,
Which characterization?
the characterization of sort of their ideal being kind of this atomized, depersonalized, decontextualized thing. I think some might sort of be in the camp you just described. But my guess is if two people heard it, one on the left, one on the right, the person on the right would be like, more likely be like, yes, and the person on the left would be like, you're mischaracterizing us.
Okay.
And that doesn't mean
Could you
there's
give a better,
no
could you
truth
give
in
a more
that.
accurate or a more resonant description of the progressive tend towards universality, or the how they incorporate the other, or
Well, I
their
liked the way you started that, because you said, okay, they're focused on like nature and sort of the earth. Because when you said that, I was like, yeah, those things are complementary. So one group is sort of focused on what do we need to nourish the family, and another group is what do we need to nourish the earth. And you
hmm,
want both of those things to thrive in a good society.
hmm.
So I feel like we
Oh.
need collaboration, and both of those need to be not decontextualized, not broken down into parts, not forcing everybody into this mold that everybody in society is automatons in a city. They both need to have to be manifest in a way
Hmm.
that has context and is aware of its context. And for different, it's possible the conservative might be a smaller context if it's family or church, and the liberal might be a bigger context if it's culture, for example. But
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
yeah, I like the dialogue here.
You put a good direction on the thing, or I don't know. Is there a word for when a compass goes like this, like a tractor? I guess
There
is
should be a
one.
word for that.
Yeah, like you put a good attractor on how to organize the thoughts. The good society, the good. Good is a good thing. Good is like this broad, great mythology generating direction. When you
Yeah.
talk about the good society, I don't know if politicians necessarily talk about that. I don't know. I guess we're all like intuitively intuiting like we're in a bad society or we want a better society. But what's a good society? What is your moral framework, like your virtue framework? Like how do you orient yourself toward the good, the beautiful and the true? Like what is the scaffolding around those core principles for you?
Yeah. And I've sort of gone back and forth about how to talk about this because of the space and that I'm occupying on my channel, that I am trying to be
Hmm.
to not put off people who are not in my particular zone.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm a Christian. Like that's my background. And it does play
Is
in
it your
with how I think
foreground?
about
Is it
things.
your
Oh,
immediate
yeah,
ground?
it's my
Okay.
foreground too.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and that mythology, I mean, it's a living relationship. It's something that is the way a person's conception of the good gets discovered through like everyday relationships, and the way God manifests through expectation and through trying to help us perceive what is beautiful in the big and the small.
That is beautiful. How does that happen? How has that happened for you? God manifesting through expectation, you said.
Yeah. I mean, it's like every morning, I sit down with God and I have different ways of meditating, and I'm trying to feel out like what is God doing in my life and what is God doing with people, and praying about that and trying to figure out, okay, what do you want for me? And I do think of it, I mean, I think of it as a dance with God where there's sort of a push and pull, and I'm constantly, when I check in with God, looking for, is there something pushing back here? Is there something pulling me in? And
Mm,
where do I sort of fall short? And it's really beautiful as a dance. And then I
mm.
think of it as a garden too, because God gives you these spaces that you have to cultivate, but you have to cultivate them by paying close attention to the people in those spaces and the earth in those spaces, and what it is you're trying to bring out that is that beautiful thing you're trying to make happen.
Hmm. How how did you end up becoming a professor? Was that a part of this honing of your attention and intuition on the good?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I sat down for like an hour and a half when in my 20s, and I was like, okay, what's the direction here? And it was just at the end of the hour and a half in a tea shop, it was like, this is the direction I need to go.
Hmm. And why economics?
I mean, I love social sciences. I love groups. And one of my friends was like, why
Hmm.
didn't you go into sociology? Why not economics, given how you think? But
Hmm.
for me, it was, I really get along well in spaces where I can be a little bit intellectually combative, where there's sort of respect that's there no matter what, and that there's not like social enforcement of ideas. And every time I've experienced that, it has been mostly men and me. And
Hmm.
economics is a space like that. I feel like sociology, there's more sort of enforcement through judgment, which that just doesn't work for me and my personality.
Hmm. Can I challenge you?
Yeah.
Okay. If enforcement of by means of judgment doesn't work for you and your personality, why do you so concerned with people disagreeing with you and being turned off by your content online?
Oh, see, I'm concerned about it because I think it would destroy the purpose of my channel.
Hmm.
It's not that I don't have a problem with people disagreeing with me. I have a problem with the disagreement forcing people into their opposite spaces where the conversation stops.
Hmm.
And I see that dynamic happening a lot when people go into specific issues, it will shut out a certain group. And you can place blame saying they shouldn't be shut out by that. But I think we need spaces where we're experimenting with how do
Hmm.
we bring groups together? And I feel that's my sweet spot. That's sort
Okay.
of where I'm called to.
Yeah. But what happens when it goes awry?
What do you mean?
What happens when people go where you don't want them to go or take what you say in a way you want it to be taken and discourse dies?
I think that's a risk you have to take. I think it's sort of, being in the space, like being in the world,
Yeah.
things are never going to go how you expect. You don't have control over that. And the best you can do is I'm doing this the best I can, and I'll make adjustments based on what I see happening. And there'll be so many lessons that'll be learned along the way. And I
Hmm.
have the grace to make those mistakes, and accept that I don't have control here.
Hmm.
But I do want to return to collapse because you did mention
Yes.
collapse
Good.
before.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so collapse, I think this is kind of a scary word, and it's an incendiary word that's used as clickbait in a lot of places. But the reason I use paradigm shift on my channel is because paradigm shift is a form of collapse that that is devastating for some, but it's freeing for others.
Hmm.
And I think that's the style of collapse that is needed.
Hmm.
And the way I explain that is it's a story, it's about academic departments. The book by Thomas Kuhn on paradigm shift goes into this, but basically you have communities of thinkers in physics or economics or whatever with foundational knowledge, and they're all building up on that foundational knowledge to build out their own little piece of the academic discipline. And you have thought leaders who are maintaining the edges of that academic discipline by saying, what's an okay question to ask that's a reasonable thing to build on our foundational knowledge?
Hmm.
That's a paradigm shift happens when you have a heretic who comes along and starts to question a piece of foundational knowledge. And that is really offensive to the thought leaders in the field because it's basically saying, you people who have built up your whole career on including this piece of foundational knowledge, it's saying basically you're stupid. And it also kind of calls into
Hmm.
question the legitimacy of the discipline. So the discipline
Hmm.
has this immune system that's like, let's go after this person, let's attack their character, let's do whatever we can to kick out the heretic. And if the heretic is strong enough to persist and just be like, okay, I'm going to continue to talk about this question I have about this, what oftentimes happens is people will listen to that person and they'll follow them, but they won't join the heretic. They won't like publish articles saying the heretic might have something to say because they know they're going to be kicked out of the field. They're not going to be able to
Yeah.
publish if they do that. But then what happens, I mean, science progresses one funeral at a time.
I knew you were going to
Eventually,
say that. I heard that in my head before you said that. Thank you.
yeah. And that's what happens. They retire, and some of these sort of quiet followers of the heretic, they get to be in these journals and they get to
Yeah.
allow some of that to come forth. And that's when the Overton window opens. But here's
Hmm.
the thing. With collapse, I think one reason people are afraid of this is because destruction is really fast, but building stuff is really slow. Like it takes a long time to build up foundations. It takes a long time to build trust in relationships and trust in institutions. So
Oh.
it's like, okay, collapse feels like, what do you do? But in this case, oftentimes the quiet followers of the heretic, they're still building out their knowledge. And that's, if they're listening to the heretic, what that might mean might be that they have to build out their own part of that academic set of knowledge by working around that piece of foundational knowledge that the heretic is questioning, by being like, can I reach what I'm trying to understand without using that faulty piece of stuff? And in doing that, they're building a new foundation, sort of quietly behind the scenes in how they understand the field. So
Hmm.
the paradigm shift, the opening of the Overton window, that can happen suddenly, and it is destructive to certain things in the field, but it can also mean the building that has happened quietly behind the scenes can suddenly come forth and build out a new foundation of knowledge that helps the whole field get around that faulty piece of foundational knowledge. And so I think that's the way to think about collapse, is that it doesn't have to be scary.
Yeah, as long as we're not talking about like the infrastructure of civilization, maybe. Practical collapse, maybe, as opposed to theoretical or paradigmatic collapse. Like the collapse in the dollar, let's say. Would that be a paradigm shift? And is Bitcoin like the heretic? Sorry to throw it to
That's not the
curveball
way
at you.
I think about it, but
No.
I don't think we can like have a specific vision. Could Bitcoin be involved in the vision? Maybe. I'm
Okay.
definitely not opposed to people building out visions that involve Bitcoin.
Okay. Yeah, I'm fascinated by this. Again, this is total hyper online stuff, and you have what's called a life, albeit a bookish life. Um, there was just like this controversy about this historian, or self-taught historian, autodidactic historian, comes on, this guy named Tucker Carlson. He's kind of a media personality, and the guy that comes on Tucker Carlson's show presents some alternative visions of World War II and Churchill's involvement of possibly prolonging or increasing the toll, the death toll, or the life toll of that conflict. And it turned out that Churchill in World War II, and Hitler and Stalin, and there's this whole mythology that's just like so foundational for people. And there were a lot of it's just really interesting to me. Some people who were heretics against this thing called the woke or progressivism or hyper progressivism, who were all about free thinking and open inquiry and mocking, all of a sudden get really defensive when you start to talk about this World War II mythology. And it's not whether or not this really arcane, I guess it's not totally arcane. It's not arcane because it's the foundation belief of their worldview. But just talking about history and questioning this narrative causes this reaction where they start to accuse this person of being an idiot, accuse them of being evil or next evil, or overemphasizing, calling him a Hitler apologist, and so on and so forth. And it's just this interesting switch from going, I'm the heretic, I'm the free thinker, to you're the heretic, you're stupid, and being really defensive. And there's this word that's called woke that used to be attached to progressivism and left. It then gets attached to the right for behaving in the manner of being offended and trying to challenge narratives and reassert some sort of order that's counter the status quo. and that word woke has broken free from progressivism, was used by the centrists to malign the right, and is now being enacted by the leftist anti-wokes, because they're now trying to police discourse and saying, why are you being silent about this? Why are you not standing up to this heresy? And so that word woke is kind of broken down, fizzled out. But it's basically what you're describing with regard to this paradigmatic shift, and how, this is kind of a human note, and I hope you can take this as a question or just as a dialogue prompt, how humility is so essential. And arrogance is very essential too, in building up your platform and having the bravado to make a mark in the world and to create something. You need to be arrogant to stand up in the first place. And maybe arrogance is the wrong word. Maybe pride's the wrong word. Maybe courage is the right word. And arrogance is courage that's disconnected from humility. But if you're too humble, you never stand up and you never take a position, right? And you are too wishy-washy, you are too fence-settery, and you don't defend things that you need to defend, because eventually you do have to defend things. It's just interesting to see the people who were lauded as the heretics are now turning around and calling out the heretics. And it's just a constant dynamic in discourse. I made an episode that I have to edit down because I said things that I don't want to be misconstrued as me taking positions that I don't necessarily take. But when we are in a state of offense or defensiveness, that's telling you something. That's telling you that this is new ground. We're breaking new ground. There's something here, and that desire to defend your presuppositions only comes about because there's something weak. I think that if you were either certain in a way or you were stable in a way, and what you were relying on for your system of thought was stable in a way, you wouldn't be so reactive in a way. And it's a process of growing more strong to go through that process of, even calling out offense, and then hopefully when the arrogance dies down and your pride, grows less tumescent maybe, or deflates, you're able to reprocess and then go through a process of renewal and reincorporating the new system. Science doesn't necessarily have to happen one funeral at a time, right? You can happen, but you're going to have to die. I think that's one of the best lessons of Christianity and its mythology. It's like, okay, you want to grow closer to God, you're going to have to die. You're going to have to die. And it's those little deaths that prepare you through grace to become closer, more conscious, or whatever it is. Better, gooder, more truthful, more beautiful, or at least more in tune with those things.
I love that. I love that you have to die. And it has to happen over and over in multiple realms. And I love the way you said there's sort of this balance between something like arrogance and something like humility, or maybe the arrogance is courage, a balance between courage and humility. I love that.
Mm-hmm. So when we're dealing with systems theory, knowledge systems, and understanding paradigm shifts, I think you have to understand that, one, you're messing around with things that might blow up in your face. Okay. Right. Lysenkoism or whatever it is, or just like the whole project of the Enlightenment, some might say, when you're trying to take a superposition outside of humanity and envision some liberal, purely universalist order, you might unleash chaos. But also, in the process, as a person, being aware that you are being shaped and you have to go through different reshapings.
Yes.
In order to achieve anything. In order to achieve authenticity, I think your authenticity is a moving target.
Yes, it is.
I need to ask you a question, but I don't have a question. Did you have a thought?
Are you trying to lead into
It's your
my
turn
experience?
To talk. That's what I'm saying. Yes, your experience. Can we get biographical? Are we deep enough?
Sure. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right. 2017, it was a magic year for both of us.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and it's weird. I've never talked about this publicly, certainly, and even not even with some of the people who it might be relevant to. But 2017, my campus went through campus shut down for a day based on some stuff related to race. And I remember at some point around then seeing, I don't know if it was your channel or something else, I saw that it was going to talk about the evergreen stuff and being like, I can't watch that because it was too emotional, like too close to what happened on our
Yeah.
campus.
It was
And
traumatic
it,
for you then.
uh, traumatic seems maybe a little bit beyond what it was, but it was, yeah, it was very emotional. Like it definitely, it took me a couple of years to process, and a lot of what I ended up doing was shaped by that because I was trying to figure out what happened. It ended up being a hoax, but um, the way it went down, looking back, I do think there was like good stuff on both sides. The administration showed up, like the whole day the campus was shut down. They showed up and dialogued, and so they weren't just laying back and giving in, but they were engaging in dialogue. And with the students, I do think there was sort of the list of demands, and I don't know where some of that came from, and I've had to think a lot about that, but they were bringing forth stories and bringing up conversations that I think were really healthy to have.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, it took me 2 years to figure out like what is my position on this. And I ended up doing like coffee with people on both sides of the spectrum. I ended up uh, doing like a student group for on dialogue across different sort of with gaining the skills of boundaries and resilience and sort of all that stuff. I called it real resilience, empathy, uh, assertiveness, and listening.
Hmm.
And then I talked to conservatives outside of campus. And what that made me realize is there's just so much like really deep thought out there that it never enters campus, but it also kind of brought out something in me that I didn't know was there, like this fire to engage across difference and this fire to learn and to have that discovery that's with people who respect you, but are willing to battle with you a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I ended up starting the Heterodox Academy Economics group. And I think because of that, it helped me figure out, first of all, something is going on at a societal level. Like I realized this wasn't just a thing on our campus. There was something coming from somewhere else that was driving it. And um
Hmm.
and it caused all these questions to come up for me.
Like a zeitgeist or an intentional or evolved ideological system of belief? Like, what do you mean there's something
So
out there?
I don't know that I could. I mean, I think it's evolved. I think it's something that is, I think it's evolved, but I think it's related to some of the things going on in the power structures.
Okay.
And the culture wars, okay, and following up after the 2017 thing, I noticed that a lot of the things that would pop up on campus that were culture war related, the
Mm-hmm.
story behind the scenes was just not the way it ended up showing up in the news in public. And the way it ended up interacting with the news and interacting with the culture wars was there was like a power dynamic trying to pull in the weight of the public opinion or the weight of something into something else that was not related to that. And
Hmm.
I had to figure out how do I understand what's going on here?
Hmm. Okay. So trying to visualize this or turn it into a story. So some event would happen on campus that would grab the attention outside of the campus. And
Yeah.
then that attention tried to turn what happened on campus into fodder for something else, or it mutated it. And so you're
Yeah.
seeing there's this power, this principality, or this egregor, if you're really weird, was consuming that and then transforming it.
Yes.
I saw that too on various levels with the Evergreen State College implosion, but it would happen on different levels. And one would be the culture war dynamic about free speech on campus or anti-racism, or the dynamics in DEI and its interaction with the truth-seeking faculty of the scholarly apparatus, but also with the ego. It would
Hmm.
it would it would transform people into not quite gods, in a Grecian sense, but kind of Shakespearean, like it would really amp up the drama and the what is it, the dramaturgy of individuals, and they would transcend. The internet would tempt them with this power that they didn't actually have, and then it would expose them to ridicule or to pushback, right? So there was a professor there, Brett Weinstein. He handled it very well because he was able to scale from the particular conversations that he had that were all recorded to a media platform and to talking to the public and defending himself on bigger platforms. Whereas certain students saw their images and were tempted into becoming something that they weren't, like some sort of agent of history, and they would get onto this stage, and then they would become complete mockeries of themselves or complete ridiculous examples of this thing. So I don't know. I'm just trying to jive with what you're saying with my particular experience, and that this interface, the public square, whatever this thing that's represented by the internet or that's hosted by the internet, would take things, amplify them, and then transform them into something. And also the actual particulars of the story of the Evergreen State College, like it would become a story for all these other narratives, right? It would become like, anti-woke narrative hedge, or, but it ended up awakening a lot of people to the dynamics that they were seeing in their workplaces, that they were seeing at their colleges, that they were seeing at their children's schools. Like, okay, this is the fruit of these lessons, right? And so it did have it turned into fodder in a lot of different ways. But when I assembled the documentary, I'm like, there's so many different moving parts to this thing that I can't particularly condense it myself, but I can kind of reveal all these different things that are going on. I'm sorry, I'm taking up a lot of airtime on this particular show.
I like it. I wanted this to be a dialogue. I wanted to learn from each other.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like the way you use the theme of myth in terms of this, where, a person has either an opportunity to become a myth, or else society just makes them into a myth, where society is pulling them into the narrative they have of what's going on. And maybe they're the villain, or maybe they're the hero. Yeah. And then behind the scenes, it's like, wait a second, it's way more complicated. Even if sometimes part of that story that's in the culture wars, part of it is real. Part of it does map onto other situations.
But you saw something concerning about that transformation or that transformative process?
I think in the follow-up, so this wasn't 2017, this was like the years following, and the way things played out following that. It made me very skeptical about the way myth was evolving, because it made me very aware that the myth that was projected onto situations wasn't what was actually there. So that caused me to create this a little bit of a distance to sort of what I was hearing in the news, and a little bit more, I don't know if skepticism is the right word, but more like, wait a second, the narrative as it's moving and as it's evolving in the public space, something's going on with the direction of that that is not fully, that sort of has its own impetus, its own desires. It's acting like something, it's acting out of power. And this is not to say that every one of these cases was like in the power structure. Some of them, it was just like, okay, that was just an ego battle behind the scenes. That was just like the normal human community thing going on that got sucked into the culture war. Other times, maybe there's something kind of related to power structures, but it's complicated. But yeah, it did force me to distance from the narrative, I guess you could say.
Which narrative? Or narrative itself?
The narratives that emerge in public space.
Okay. You're very wary of them.
I don't know if I would say that, but maybe a little bit. I want to maintain a little bit of distance from them.
Yeah. There was the brother of Brett Weinstein. His name is Eric Weinstein, and he's a smart man as well as Brett is. He'd made a tweet. I can't recall it right now, but it was an interesting tweet about free speech and how just this domain of discourse is different than we think it is. It's not just like transmitting packets of information. And it made me think of a thought experiment that I had, which was actually a science fiction novel, where in this great simulation that people make in order to live the way that they need to in the future, there's this realm of fictions where you can go there and you can see these mythologies and you interact with them and you're able to kind of see these collective thoughts, these egregores, and they're kind of monsters. And human beings are actually in discourse, in the realm of discourse. Jung's idea of like ideas, people don't have ideas have people. Or in the space of the culture war, it's like, I'm not fighting a person that has certain ideas. I'm fighting a person who is operating this system of thought, this mythology, as you call it. And this mythology is actually this living creature. It's a kind of a dinosaur towards me, and I can try to fight it, but actually it'll probably crush me, and it would take a lot of us to kind of pull it apart. And then there's a lot of people that are feeding on that, you know, and living off of that system that you don't even understand what you're dealing with, right? So there's this way in which you see particular stories such as Evergreen become mythologized. It's literally a mythology now. It's like when people like for a certain small set of people, like they think of the Evergreen State College and they have all these images in their head, and like Lord of the Flies comes to mind, and you have this kind of mythos. And then you see what happened in 2020 with the completely non-infectious vector inciting protests that were allowed. You know, you couldn't protest against lockdowns, but you could totally protest against the end of racism. You see the same play, the same drama playing out that you did at Evergreen. It's just like, it's much bigger. And you see the fallout, the same thing. It's like, actually the kids are going to get their jollies off, and then the bureaucrats are going to come in and tighten down on everybody and put more and more control. The system itself is going to insert its phalanges or whatever into more and more speech, into more and more like thought, and like to concretize itself, and to the belief system through the bureaucratic mechanisms of DEI trainings and stuff, like exerts itself in the flow. And that's what happens to the system. So you just see these different, and the way that something like that can scale is really magnificent in a way. It's like, how can this idea or the set of beliefs go from causing this thing to happen over here and then also scaling globally? Like there's something, and it's not intentional. It wasn't really planned, but there's enough human actors in there that you can kind of say, you can kind of do a breakdown of how the thought works and the incentive structures and stuff like that, but it just has a life of its own. And so I guess what you were saying is that you're kind of aware that that's always happening, or what?
Yeah, no, yeah, aware that that's always happening. And so 2020, because there was sort of a scaling up, like what happened with us in 2017. I did feel like 2020 was almost the peak of the expansion of that thing.
Yeah.
But also because we'd gone through the 2017 thing, the follow-up to that, I did feel like some people found their integrity, and I was able to see, okay, what does it look like for people on campus to find their integrity in this space? And I think this mirrors the 2020 bit, because I do feel like 2020 was the peak of what some people would call woke. And I'm neither woke nor anti-woke. I do kind of straddle those two spaces, but
Wait, how are you woke? How woke are you?
How woke am I?
Yeah.
Well, so the systemic injustice and social justice, I think the set of concepts that are in that space and the embodiment of those by looking at relationships and the way power plays out in relationships, that is so powerful. And I don't see full understanding of that in anti-woke spaces. Sometimes I'm like, wait a second, if people in those anti-woke spaces recognize some of these dynamics, I think they would see some of the dynamics that they experience that match up with it. They would be much better able to collaborate with some of the groups who relate more to woke because they have those personal experiences where there is this dynamic that's hard to talk about, but it's real and it's there. And some of the systemic injustice, social justice language captures it. Um, but
I
yeah, so
find that
go
stuff.
ahead.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I forgot what I was going to say.
It's just no. I find it powerful. Yeah, exactly. It's powerful. So
Mhm.
therefore, it needs to be handled with respect, right?
Yes.
And be careful because I think it turns people into monsters. I don't know why, but it turns people into monsters. It latches on to the mechanisms of the human, and heightens their victimhood and their arrogance, their power seeking, and the whole concept of justice and injustice is, I don't have power, I want power. So it's actually like it is about empowerment, but if you don't understand the mechanisms of power, it's just a license to become an asshole, right? It basically that's what it feeds on this circuit, the same kind of, it's a very evolved circuit of like fairness, and yet it can turn everything into, unless you can really be an adult, your child comes out, your me mine, like it really turns people into children, and then it turns people into coddling, this kind of coddling mothers, like, I will take care of you, I will make you feel bad and good at the same time, I feel your pain. And that's where the bureaucratization happens, which is also just really creepy to me, because that's like inverted power structure. Like that's a bad. So the analysis is really powerful, but like the mythology is just like, it gives me the willies. And maybe I'm misinterpreting what I'm saying. So please
Well,
run with it.
so this is why I say I'm both woke and anti-woke. Because I mean, I obviously when the 2017 thing went down, there's definitely like victims of that where they were just destroyed, where the monster that had these demands or whatever, it didn't care about the wreckage. There was a part of it that was power seeking and not able to actually engage in the kind of discernment that is required for justice. So,
Mm,
um, I so at the same time, it brought forward people's stories that needed to be brought forward. It brought up conversations that were really healthy, and at the same time, it had this devouring part of it that it was not willing to actually look at the destruction it created.
hmm
And I think what was really powerful for me after it, sort of moving in the years beyond it, was, like I said, it took me a couple years to process, like, where do I stand with this? There have been people on my campus that have been, some people would probably put them in the woke camp, who are more sort of in the social justice, systemic racism camp, but who processed it enough to where they recognize the need for discernment. You can't just like whatever's using the language of systemic injustice, that gets its will. And I've
Okay.
seen people in that camp who have put bounds on the unhealthy parts of that,
Hmm.
and who have sort of uplifted the healthy parts. And what that requires on their part is this discernment where they're looking at this specific case. Is this person trying to get power or just trying to be a bully? Or is this person uh, advocating for a need that has been underheard, that has been pushed to the wayside for too long, that needs to
Mm,
be heard? And they can discern that.
hmm
And watching people live out in that space in a way that's discerning has been really helpful for me. And I think that the place I've come to it in terms of understanding that is I'm understanding the same dynamic is true of maps, like all maps, which includes religious maps. It includes the economics map. It includes social justice map, where if you get too stuck in just the map and it's not interacting with reality, it's not discerning,
hmm
then the map is designed to have some use of power. That's what maps do. They bring things forward in a power way.
hmm
Um, and I'm guessing in the Old Enlightenment with religion, there were spaces where the religious maps were used in a power sort of way. There's definitely spaces in where the economic tool set is used to make decisions about how resources flow in a way that is, it's about power rather than about discernment about what's going on here, rather than open to seeing the full side effect of it's the way it acts out power. So I think any map can have both a just and an unjust
hmm
manifestation.
What is power?
Power. That's a good question. I mean, I think it's the ability to influence other people.
Okay. What happens when you're given power? What's happened
Power.
to you? Have you had to
What's
learn to deal with it? Yeah. Do you want power or do you not want power? Or you're neither power seeking nor power rejecting?
Well, power is necessary to enact values in the world. So like the problem is the problem is you can't ever separate good and evil, I don't think. If you want to bring about life-giving spaces and if you want to support communities and living out values that uh, bring about more connection and bring about healing for the earth and for people and for communities, you
Hmm.
can't do that without power. But of course, power, it's really easy once a person has power to use it to get more power. And we all kind of know some people will do something just to have a little power for a moment. There's something about it that's seductive. So yeah.
When the things happened in 2017, do you feel like you were watching it happen or was it happening through you? Were you aware of it happening through you?
I was definitely aware of it happening through me because I mean I knew I had a role I was like how do we respond in our department and we had sort of a um like inviting students to come and give us critiques as a department. And I remember that, and I was like, it was like the whole economics department behind me, and then students out there, and I was
Yeah.
fielding questions. So I knew I had to respond in some way, which could have been just step back and not respond.
Yeah.
Um, but I needed a lot of space to figure out what my actual views on it were. And at times, there's been moments where I'm like, I don't like the way I handled that. And moments where I'm like, I don't
Yeah.
want power in certain realms because I don't think I have the strength to actually do what
Wow.
is needed. Like my role is best spent usually just like thinking in the background rather than actually having certain types of power.
Yeah. Because there's that question, like, why wasn't I woke? Like, if I was surrounded on Evergreen campus by this very powerful release of kinetic sociological energy, and it was being pushed on us so hard by the people that the administration empowered to implement this anti-racist dogma, why was I immune to that? And I watched it did shape me because that was my social milieu. So I knew I couldn't say things. So I had to suppress myself. And I knew there were certain things I couldn't say. Can't joke about pronouns. You can't question why, like people's language marginalized. Like all of a sudden the kids, and I was older too. So there's all these different reasons why I wasn't a part of that. But there was just something that resists in me collective worship of something other than God. And what I felt was that they're worshiping something other than God. And there was something, and I have a hard time even worshiping collectively the one true God. Like I'm very like wary about collective. So I think there was a dynamic. So I was just wondering if you're in academia, it's 2017. I'm sure you were subject or have been subject to a battery of ideological trainings on how these, social justice language, let's just say. It's like you don't hear people like making the English department take a course on Austrian economics, but you do hear people making the English department take courses on DEI, right? So there's something about like this academic discipline that is enforced by the institution where other academic systems aren't. Like not everybody, and there's an ideological content in that. So how did you ingest that, metabolize that, not let it interfere with your discernment?
I think that's a good question. I mean,
And that's
see,
assuming, maybe I'm assuming that it's something you disagree with, and maybe it's not something that you disagree with.
see, I feel on both sides of it because I see, I mean, I see, yeah, I feel a little bit on both sides, but I think for a genuine version of social justice and systemic injustice, for that to
Hmm.
actually play out well, you need people to interact with their authentic selves. And it was really clear whenever there was sort of these diversity trainings and sort of things that, came on the scene after that, following it, people were not interacting with their authentic selves. And I think everybody knew it. And even people who are genuinely for social justice recognized that. And that's not actually real power. So it is a sort of power, but it has,
A shelf life.
yeah, exactly. It has a shelf life.
Hmm.
And I think for me, I mean, I try on ideas by embodying them. So, if you were to go back, I'm sure there were times where I was saying things experimentally that were kind of going along, and it was probably uh, partly inauthentic, but also partly
Yeah.
experimental.
Yeah.
But I think that's also why talking to conservatives was where I got to discover that was helpful for me to sort of play different roles where I could embody this role and embody this role and like see what works for me,
Yeah.
what feels authentic.
Yeah. And where did you land? I think you describe yourself as neither woke nor anti-woke. I think
Yeah.
Christian is probably just a better word for that. Have you heard the theories on where wokeness comes from? It's basically a strain of Puritanism that shed all of its God language, all its theology.
Yeah, I've heard that. I don't I don't know about that characterization. I think there's some truth in that. Like I do think there's a God-shaped hole that gets filled by some of that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Can economics be valueless? Can there be any economic system without value? I mean,
No.
without, okay, so it's going to impose a value on the world, or it's going to interact with values, right?
Well, I mean, it's going to have some way of determining collective intelligence. So some way of aggregating values, which is going to weigh different people's values
Oh,
differently.
collective intelligence. Jeez. Isn't that scary? Isn't it scary? Or is it fascinating?
What
It's
what
like
does
you're,
that word mean to you?
I don't know. I just kind of imagine you as like this, like kind of this princess, like petting this dragon's nose, and you're just like, you're right next to this huge, powerful thing. And you're kind of just like inspecting it. And you're like, okay, like, what is this thing? Like collective intelligence, right?
Hmm.
Like, that's like scary. And then, no. I guess
What, so
Paul
I
talks
mean, I'm
about
trying
that
to
in
understand
Romans,
what's your
right?
understanding of collective intelligence.
I
Like,
mean,
I'm really curious about this.
yeah. I mean, St. Paul, I don't know if you're Catholic or not. You just said Christian.
Mhm.
But Paul talks about, like the church is like your body of Christ, or your body of Christ. So you're kind of joining, and there's this awareness that I'm a part of a system, and I might be a fingernail or a toe or an eye, and I have to, it's a really helpful analogy because you're like, there's a lot of people who are lower than me, but they are absolutely essential to my well-being. And there's like a fractal in the way that I interact with them. And so respect needs to govern, or love, I guess, needs to govern all of my interactions with other people, because that's how we become a whole good body. But when you think about terms and things in terms of economics, like there's just so, it can be so dehumanizing. I don't know, but maybe I'm wrong in thinking that, or maybe I'm just wary of that tendency. And that's why I asked, can economics be valueless? And what I meant was, can economics like just reduce us into this objective point of view? Can it take an objective point of view that's actually without some sort of interacting with power, or without like leaning into that in some way? And then how do you do it cleanly, or how do you do it properly? Like what is the values that govern the discipline of economics?
See, I really like the way you say this, where you're part of a body. Yeah, you're an eye or a foot, or and the body has to be. It has to care for other parts of the body, and it has to respond to them. And collective intelligence. I mean, markets are a form of collective intelligence. Voting is a form of collective intelligence,
Hmm.
but both of those are a little bit disembodied. Like you're sort of this individual vote, and
Yeah.
it doesn't always. It can, but it doesn't always fully take into account the relationship between these different parts and the meaning and the kind of exchange of value that happens between those different parts. And
Yeah.
I think for a healthier system to come about that has the potential to sort of heal itself and sort of evolve in a way that will pick up the pieces of the mess that's been created so far, it can't just treat people in a disembodied way. Um,
Huh.
it needs to account for more of the relationships that happen within
Yeah.
groups and within families and within between individuals and society. And how do you do that? And that's the question.
Is there like a branch of economic thought that studies relationships in this way?
So institutional economics, I think, is pretty, it's a pretty broad branch.
Hmm.
And I find myself, I mean, like I said, I tend to exist in the in-between where people are talking past each other. So, like institutional economics and behavioral economics,
Hmm.
I'm kind of right at the intersection there. And I think both groups don't understand each other fully.
Hmm.
But yeah, institutional economics has more
Is
of
that not
the
an economic problem?
institutional economics zooms back and does look at like law and economics as that's an economic issue and it'll model it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it includes like systems theory and evolutionary theory and
Yeah.
um yeah.
Yeah. I mean, isn't it an economic problem, like to figure out how these two groups are relating to each other and maybe co-processing with each other and how those two groups actually increase each other, their
Yes.
productivity or whatever?
I think that is the correct way to use economic maps, is it to use them as structures of relationships. It's like, okay, what's the relationship between a mother and a daughter?
Yes.
And you get an intuition from that, both by having a
Hmm.
model in your head of mother and daughter, and by looking at the real world and looking how does that play out in different families, how does that play out in different species, and like an economic model when it's used well, it has relationships between things that are not just this causes this. They're not simplistic. It's kind of like when this moves, this one moves, but it does it in a way that's nonlinear and is through this other mechanism.
Wow.
And if you just look at the model itself, it's this, it is like disembodied, it's not real. But if you look at it as, okay, I want to see things in the world, I want to see relationships between people, I want to see relationships between mothers and sons and between power, people in power and people underneath them. I want to see those in a new way.
Hmm.
And if you go back and forth between sort of the reality of what you're seeing in different contexts and a model that can just structure a different style of relationship, yeah, I think that is a mature way to use the tool set of
Hmm.
economics.
How has that influenced your political thinking? Like how governments should be structured?
I don't know. I think my thinking, I've almost sort of disengaged a little bit in terms of my political thinking, just because I'm like, okay, I only have so much brain space.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
not that I don't care politically, and it's not even that political stuff doesn't play out in this space. It's more just that I think where I'm called to look requires a little bit of detachment from a lot of,
Okay.
especially the issues where people get really um, polarized.
What are you looking at then? Mostly
Hmm?
right now, this year. What have you been looking at?
In terms of,
If you're not looking at politics, what are you studying? Or because you said you gave an example of things that you're not thinking about because you're being called to look at this other thing. What is this other
yes,
thing? Yeah.
this other thing is like, it's like the system. It's like the structures, the way information flows. Oh, and you mentioned like halfway through the conversation, at some point you said knowledge systems in a way that was
Yeah.
not the way I think about it. When
Oh,
I think
okay.
about knowledge systems, I think about sort of academic spaces and how we create knowledge there. I think about journalism and how we create knowledge there. And I think
Hmm.
about social media and how knowledge flows through the system there.
Hmm.
And so it's not that I just don't go deep with those issues. I'm kind of aware that they're there. I see
Yeah.
there's a polarization. I assume if I did go deep with any of them, I would probably have an opinion that's stronger on one side or the other than I have it. But
Hmm.
more, I'm looking at it from a higher level and just being like, what are the dynamics that are shaping how information moves and how it gets legitimized and how it interacts with each person's intuition about what is meaningful and valuable and like their perception of value
Hmm.
in the world.
Hmm. What are you seeing? What are you finding? What's your findings? I know we're not publishing in any sort of peer review sense. So maybe you want to keep something closer to your chest about what you're.
It's more that like, I mean, I'm writing a book on this. It's just, I don't know that I could articulate it in like a, I don't even know that I could articulate it now. It's
Let
more than
yourself
I
try.
try to articulate.
Venture. Yeah.
Okay, venture. Okay. I mean, some of it relates to the stuff we talked about on collapse is part of it. Like, we need a way of visualizing collapse. What are the analogies that we'll need to move into a different space? Because we're going to need analogies. And I think the human body system and forest are good analogies because
Hmm.
they sort of self-heal and they recycle. There's the
Hmm.
power to the powerful dynamics. There's a lot going on there in terms of pyramid structures and industries that are pyramid industries like academia and Hollywood, where people's pay is essentially the hope of moving up into roles that have influence and creative license and all of that. Um,
Hmm.
so uh, that's part of it.
Are pyramids perennial, or are they better? Are you more into the disc?
What do you mean?
Well, social justice wants to equitize everything, so nobody's greater than anybody else, but it ends up making a crater. It like ends up inverting the pyramid with the oppressed on the most top. So what do you think about just hierarchy itself?
I mean, I think forest systems have some hierarchy, and have some structure. Like even within the body, there's hierarchy, but yeah, you can't. You have to treat each person as unique, and whatever their orientation to the world is, whatever their unique perception is, whatever they have to bring to the world. If you try to equalize things, you totally lose the actual essence of real human beings.
Hmm. Well, I guess it's like a perennial Christian question, like you're in the world but not of the world kind of thing, right? And then also just like let Caesar be Caesar kind of thing. It's like there's power in the world, magnificent, terrible, demonic, and yet God blessed power in the world. There's these big trees or big beasts in the world, like these structures. So we don't want to tear those down unnecessarily because they are what they are. The world is the world. So how do you study it and then also participate in it? Right, because I guess what I'm trying to ask you, say you in one of the things that I was listening to, and you can clarify what you were saying, but you said to reconceptualize how power flows to the powerful, right? So is that not just a pyramid? The more powerful you are, the more power you get, and as long as you're circulating the power or the resources that power is creating, then it's a whole system. Or do you want to not have a hierarchical power structure? Like, is power structure bad? That's another way of phrasing how woke are you?
Um, well, so there's hierarchy in the forest, right? But there's also balance, and there's sort of the checks and balances between
Hmm.
different parts of the forest.
Okay.
And forest is one of the analogies. Um, I mean, I think the key with power is that n not all power is the same. Power is attuned to different things.
Hmm.
And with human societies, power needs to be attuned in a way that has the possibility of capturing the negative side effects of what it's looking at. Like if I'm looking at whatever hierarchy could exist in a healthier system, there are rules that have excess ability to determine where resources flow, accessibility to determine who gets punished and who gets off the hook. and those kinds of things. And those roles, what's needed for those roles is people who are capable of looking at the hard facts about the negative side effects of what they do. And that's a really hard thing for people to do. So making sure that the attunement in those nodes, those nodes is toward a variety of groups, and that there's kind of checks and balances that interweave with each other. So it's not that there's no hierarchy. It's that the mechanisms that determine what rises in the hierarchy, what will have more power, those need to be in balance somehow.
And how has that been affected in human civilization to the good in eras past?
I don't know if I can answer that right now. I mean, I guess what I'd say to that is, there's been like lots of cycles throughout history, and history is long and complex, and that at the same time, that doesn't mean that every cycle had the same amount of justice and the same amount of bringing forth the beautiful. If we look at different cycles of the way this played out, because it does tend to power to the powerful, and then there's some chaos, and that resets things in a certain way. If we were to look at that, we could be discerning about what moments in that did things go better versus worse, and hopefully learn something from that. I do think this moment, I do think we're in sort of a reset moment where there's chaos, and new technologies, I think, could play a big role in some of the changes. And I think this moment is different than past moments because of technology and because of the interconnections, and the role of networks is a little bit different. So, I mean, I would just hope that some good lessons would be taken in, and I would hope, however it plays out, is just, I don't know. I'm just trying to play whatever role I feel called to in that little piece. It's not that I'm redesigning a whole system. It's that I'm trying to draw people's attention to
You're in descriptor
truth
mode
about how
right
the
now.
system works, and to possibilities, and to creative thinking.
Okay. Networks is really interesting. To go back to an earlier example where I veered us into like discourse on Twitter or X or whatever. It's like I have connections with people, and I see them behaving in a way where I'm like, well, you're enacting what you criticized. I notice hypocrisy, but I have to be really careful how I state that, because then that would damage my connection and my network. And then I would just silo myself off, and then I would have to be connected to another network in which that would happen all over again. And you saw this really interesting moment where a lot of people like kind of ran out of this network that was being controlled by the thing that we then called woke, right? A lot of people fled that, and there was a moment of solidarity because everybody's, Paul Vanderklay talks about like a delta gets flooded, and then there's a lot of cross-pollination, and then the water goes down and people like kind of silo again. And you watch this happen over and over again, where an event happens that catches everybody's attention, and then it breaks everybody apart into these different networks. And in order to be able to be a kind of creature that can interact with different networks, I have to reserve my judgment, not necessarily my discernment. So I have a discernment, but I can't voice it without damaging the network. And it's further exacerbated by the knowledge that without connection, no criticism is going to even have any sort of, it's not going to be taken, right? You have to have in the way that these networks form, people call it echo chambers. They form by agreement, and then they break apart by disagreement. They don't form by human connection that has been forged by a daily pattern of life, like buying a coffee or going on a bike ride. They form through agreement, or through somebody is like, something's wrong over here, and then everybody agrees, and then you find a bunch of people that agree with you. And then you have to encounter disagreement. And real relationship only forms when the cycle of agreement and disagreement can allow for deeper knowledge to happen. But because connections are so brittle, fragile, and fast on the internet, disagreement can lose your connection. So you have to kind of carefully reserve your voicing of discernment in order not to damage the network preemptively. But at the same time, you're like, but this is going to damage the network if this group of people goes in this direction. You have to call things out. It's an interesting, I guess, game theory is another way to maybe conceptualize it, but it's an interesting position to be in, because my well-being in the network relies on the currency of agreement, or likability can be another way to do it. If you have charisma or charm, you can be disagreeable or disagreed with because people still like you. So there's different ways to overcome that vector and be able to express disagreement or judgment, or call somebody out, right? And I think that, that what you were talking. One more thought. I'm really sorry. I'm talking way too much in this episode.
Like this.
One thing that you said, to harken back to what you were saying about social justice, the inauthenticity of certain spaces that you were in. Like people coming to you and bringing you a complaint, like if it's not founded on a reciprocal, mutual respect of humanity, and only one party is seen as human and the other party is seen as either superhuman as in villains, or subhuman as in villains. If there's an inequality of humanity on both sides, then it's just like, this is not going to shake out to anything. This is not going to actually solve anything. This is not actually authentic. It's not going to actually build things. And one skill that's just lacking, or that needs to be reified in education, is the humanities. Like the humanities lost the humanity at some point along the path, and it might be when there's an interesting theory about, like, once the colleges let go of the seminary, they were founded around a seminary, and once they took the seminary out, like, it needed something there, and the DEI religion kind of came and took its place. Like, there has to be a moral direction that this intellectual discourse is taking.
Well, I do think the humanities, I don't think it's lost everywhere. Like, I do think there's lots of faculty who are teaching in the humanities who really do get at the essence of being a human, but it sort of takes place in the classroom, in these spaces that I think the space is sometimes invaded by the online discourse in a way where it can devolve, but also there's so few places where authentic conversation about real human stuff can find space. And I think a lot of the humanities faculty are sort of expert at bringing that out.
Including the economicists?
Well, economists are not humanities, but I definitely value.
No, you're not, but it's value laden.
I guess in our college we're social sciences.
Okay. Yeah, and that's not a humanities. I guess I'm just like getting us in the weeds of semantics and stuff.
Oh.
But you're definitely, we're not humanities. We're super humanities.
Well, I value the humanities. For whatever reason, our college, has humanities as like philosophy and literature, and that's what
Okay, and then social sciences is, and then you have your STEM, I guess, would be, is social sciences attached to that or between those two? STEM
social sciences humanities is separate, and then natural sciences and
natural sciences.
Yeah, it's physics and math and psychology. Yeah.
Oh, psychology too.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the natural sciences.
Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, I guess the way things are categorized different places is different.
Yeah. Yeah. So where are you headed, do you think, in what you're going to be talking about specifically on your channels? Like, what is the shape of the future for you?
I mean, it's really just fleshing out these three areas, like economics, governance, and knowledge systems, to figure out what is needed for a different style of governance. And I think it does have to be discourse that deeply integrates relationship into the process. And the way dialogue happens in public spaces, that's part of governance. So I want to
Mm.
explore that more deeply. What does it look like to make relationship more front and center in our systems?
Can it scale? Can relationships scale? Like, that's kind of is that a software issue or a hardware issue? Like, there's some number. It's like 150. It's somebody's number,
The
or
Dunbar number?
yeah, you can only know 150 people.
Yeah.
Can
I don't
relationship
know.
scale? And then you have the whole like parasocial relationship. I mean,
Yeah.
you have what? How many subscribers? You're at 30 or 40K or something like that.
No, 9,000.
Oh, okay, you're under 10K, but you still like you're one person, and then there's 10,000 people, or maybe there's 4 to 40,000 people that tune into any given channel, and there's a relationship there. But how does that relationship scale? And there's like kind of a Plato's cave-ishness to that relationship, right? And does that count
Yeah.
as relationship in your mind?
Um, there's different styles of relationship. And I think
Oh, okay.
making space in our heads for like what are the different types of spaces with different styles. I do think sort of what you're talking about with actually, I don't know enough about the term parasocial relationship, but
No.
the sort of like one person who's processing stuff and who's listening to a community and trying to articulate maybe the grievances of that community or the
Hmm.
what that community perceives that other people don't. I think there's usefulness in that in part because some people will call for the place for us to hash out some of these issues is in our interpersonal relationships.
Hmm.
And I think that that can be so unhealthy because oftentimes it just destroys like interpersonal relationships that need to be really strong. Whereas if there's enough of an interaction with someone you care about, you're in community with, that you care enough about to understand their perspective, finding someone who can articulate their perspective online to
Hmm.
people like you without the contempt toward people like you, but who can actually speak across that difference, I think that can really help um, solve some of the
Hmm.
understandings. Because I mean, a lot of what the discourse is doing right now, it's like there are ways we could collaborate such that both groups' issues can be solved. Like this group is in pain and this group is in pain, and they're both
Hmm.
blaming each other. And it's like the conversation devolves around whose issue is more important. It's like we have to solve that before we can solve anything else.
Yeah.
And setting that aside such that, okay, wait a second, we're going to spend a lot of time trying to find ways that both can be addressed. And there might be some point at the top where a decision between the two will have to be made, but that's the last resort. And developing ways that that can happen, I think, could involve just different structures of dialogue. I don't know.
Hmm. What do you mean different structures of dialogue? Can you concretize that?
Yeah, so I think there needs to be different types of spaces. Like in terms of free speech, I think you need spaces where people can process painful things that have happened to them. And that tends to be really messy, and people tend to blame groups and come up with these like
Yeah.
mythologies about, the person who did that to you, why are they like that? It's because of this group they're in, and it's because of this map they're using. And you need spaces where people can just go to town with their contempt that's usually arising for something they experienced. And you need
Yeah.
to create space for that. And that's sort of like a free speech space. But then you also need spaces for connecting across difference where it's like this space, it's not that we're controlling heavily from above. It's that to enter into this space, it's understood that we want these two sides, we want both of their grievances to be addressed.
Hmm.
And to be in this space means you're living up to an ethic. And I think there's going to need to be styles of ethics in different spaces of
Hmm.
discourse. That's kind of like the ethics of lawyers is actually kind of counterintuitive. It's like you defend somebody even if you think they're guilty. You might have to do that. And for the system to work well, you need people to enter into that ethic despite its counterintuitive feeling. And I
Hmm.
think there does need to be spaces where the ethic is an ethic of collaboration across difference, which does not mean neutral. It just means we're attempting to speak across these two particular perspectives.
Hmm. Yeah, like there's different ways of interacting in the parlor and in the pub. right? And there's gentleman agreements that dictate, when you can throw a punch and when you throw a witticism, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And the problem is with the open internet, those places are emergent but need to be moderated, and then they break apart. They just kind of pop up and then fizzle out, pop up and fizzle out. That's what I've seen over the course of.
Well, yeah, I think the structure of the way information flows, it's not intentional enough about creating sustaining value to these. And I think one of the problems we have overall in our system is that there are spaces where something keeps people in the space despite conflict, which you need, because in any human space, there's going to be conflict, and you need
Yeah.
something that's where I'm going to persist. And like for me, on campus, I've had conflicts with different people and I've come out on the other side. And sometimes that actually heals our relationship because I know, okay, I can come through a conflict with this person. But why did I stay there? I mean, it's my job. I'm sort of like, there's something that stuck me there. And for some people, like your commitment to your family has that sticking power. And right now, online spaces do not have that sticking power. But I think people are, would you disagree with that?
They tend to be most sticky when there's a grievance going on. I mean, studying the the gender discourse, you have like the trans rights activists and then the TERFs, which they readopted. It was supposed to be a slur, but like the radical feminists, I guess you could say, or the gender critical feminists. And you can see the dynamics over time, how they position themselves and vilify themselves and then try to claim different moral high grounds, right? And then you have people such as detransitioners who were damaged by gender medicine, tragically in certain cases, because they were just writing out this way of thinking that didn't map onto reality all that well in the last. And then they get taken up by the gender critical side as like examples of why the trans rights activist side is wrong. And then, but then the detransitioners are like, well, I don't believe in all this other stuff. I don't believe like that because the gender critical stuff comes from feminism, which has a grievance against the patriarchy. And then there's this whole set of things. And then you have this falling out, and then you have this radicalization over here and this radicalization over there. And then you have scientists coming in. They're like, we don't even know the data. And if they try to talk to the data, then the trans rights activists will call them like all these names and try to smear them. And there's all these moneyed interests. It's just this huge system of different collective. It's just like this. It's a war zone kind of thing. And there's all these individuals. If you study, you can see all these individuals, and then there's different bonds. And you can see that these groups do have staying power, depending on how they leverage grievance, or depending on how they leverage the connection on a positive. We're trying to work for trans rights, or we're trying to work towards women's rights, or we're trying to work against the encroachment of somebody on our rights. And you can see that there's some stickiness in there. But then there's always this kind of process of falling out, and these egos rising and falling within the discourses, and then these different lines being drawn, and then different internal conflicts. It's just fascinating. Also, like the dissonant right has this whole process, and then the IDW kind of space. So you do have these instances where there's collaboration, and then there's this breaking apart, and then this reforming of lines. The map is really crazy. I don't know if anybody's actually mapped it. There have been some attempts to map it, but it has been ideological attempts to try to connect everybody to the far right, so-called, by making all these connections, but not really understanding that there's all this cross-pollination of all these ideas. And if you say, there was this term a few years ago called alt-right adjacent, where instead of like, it was literally guilt by association, saying he's basically kind of closer to the racist than I am, but it actually ties you're alt-right adjacent too, because you're not understanding that we're all connected. And I'm trying to explain something super complex that you're making me think of to try to concretize what you're saying about these systems, these relationships interacting with the online interface.
What you said just sounds like so overwhelming, and it just,
yeah, I was watching your face the whole time.
I couldn't be mischaracterizing what this is, because it seems like and it's like, this is what needs to be rejiggered because that, what you just described, seemed very strategic, where every relationship was founded on a strategy of something the group wanted and was trying to get, which is not always bad because sometimes it's what they're trying to get is like human rights.
Well, that's how you get relevance. Like that's how you earn network power. That's how you get known in the network, is
Hmm.
by being agreeable or conciliatory to certain people's ends. It just happens automatically. There's no real, I mean, the more radical they get, the more tight they are and more explicit they are on what they want. Right. But like mostly people just like rise up because they connect to what people want to hear. It's just basically how it happens.
Yeah. I mean, I compare that to workplaces and families where there's this in-person thing. And I feel
Hmm.
like the difference is that
This
in these,
in-person thing. Isn't
yeah,
that
this
so
whole
earth.
in-person thing. Yeah, no, it's like a good foundation of the in-person thing has to involve not just us getting something we want, even if that's a good thing, like rights for our group, but it's like it's us seeing each other as real people and
Yeah.
attending to needs that are not
Yeah.
that don't fit in the category.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there needs to be some um the ch whatever change in the structure could heal is going to need to facilitate more of the thing that is relationship for the sake of just this relationship.
Yeah. 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 I was in I was involved in a kerfuffle, just to illustrate what you're talking about. There was this content creator, this feminist content creator, who decided to build her platform around criticism, specifically like calling people out. And she started calling people out who were over there. And then anybody who was against this group kind of like accepted her. And then she started just like not being able to train it on the outside. She started training it on the group. And I was like, I was outside of her group enough to train her criticism on me. And she made this huge deal out of this joke tweet that I made. And she did this struggle session for about 2 weeks where she just made video after video about how misogynistic I am, how I'm a traitor to the cause, traitor to women, and blah, 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 blah. And she's going on and on and on. And I'm like, I try to reach out and connect to her. I'm like, you don't understand how this game is played. This game is not played based on criticizing the other. It's actually about folding people into relationship. Like that's the actual strategy to do that. So why don't we get on a stream and talk about rock and roll and talk about something completely else and not even mention this thing to kind of show and to really step out of it and show the humanity that exists beyond this thing. And she was having none of it because she was locked into that one thing. She eventually, like her game plan fizzled out because she ended up just burning all the bridges because she wasn't building any bridges. So you have to kind of, certain people go through that too quickly or get hooked on that aspect of it. So there is that aspect of it, but you can't, it is totally possible to have just relationship be the key to the whole
Yeah.
thing. And it
Does
is
that happen
possible. It's just,
online?
yeah, that was all online. It was all
But I
online.
mean, have you seen spaces online where the relationship is the forefront of what the
Okay.
space is?
Oh, my channel. I'm kidding. You can probably tell, like I have a bias and stuff, but I move through the world through relationship. That's the only thing I agree with because I don't have strong opinions, but I have strong likes and dislikes. You know,
Uh-huh.
so I just like people that I like, and so I just go in that direction rather than like I have an end goal. But I do like being in trouble. My wife says for and we're navigating through that aspect of my personality. But I think that, yeah, I think in the podcast space, outside of Twitter, I think the podcast space, what it is exemplifying is a return to well, one, a style of media that is couched in the relationship, the embodiment that is, even though it's disembodied, it still happens through voice rather than text. It's a return to vocal society or an oral society, which interacts
Hmm.
with the human organism in a different way than text does. And I think that people feel a lot, I don't know, it would be interesting study to do on how close people feel to a fictional character that's really well realized in a piece of literature or a movie, and like how empathetic they are in a movie, and how in the tacosphere, in the voice network, in podcasting land, how people's relationship, even though it's one way, it's parasocial, how the relationship forms with the speaker is different than how they would form to somebody who's writing. And I've seen that over and over again. One of the things that I really like to do is take somebody who hasn't really done a podcast, who's mostly known on Twitter for writing things, and to get them to talk. And there's these examples where you have an image of this person in your head because you've only read their writing. And then in 2 minutes, you're like, oh, that's who that person is. You're like, oh, that's who they are. Like there's this who-ness that is being conveyed. And then also you can talk about how long form has a different impact on the relationships that are being exemplified, extolled, and expressed.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. And I agree. I think there's something different about podcasting. And I wish there was more outlets, like when I'm trying to brainstorm what could different structures look like, for people to participate without podcasting being immediately public. Because I think for a lot of people, that's scary if you put something online, like a 2-hour conversation and somebody takes a little clip, and that's the weaponization of the way things happen.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've done a lot of private podcasts where it's like me and a friend, and we're like, okay, we're just going to have a conversation, and it's going to be recorded. And that does something, it kind of ups the level of the conversation just a little bit in this way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when I first started the Heterodox Academy group, I wanted to get to know the other leaders of different groups. Like I was economics, so what's the sociology, psychology leader? Who are these people? And it was just meaningful because, yeah, an hour-long conversation and you get to know who they are. Yeah. And it takes it out of the culture war space and makes it into this human space.
Yeah, it's high. There's a certain level or type of person who can take the culture war into a long-form discourse. So it's usually in the form of a debate. And it usually has at root some sort of antagonistic or win state situation to it, but it becomes inherently kind of cringe, or just it doesn't really work when you take the culture war way of communicating and you do it in this mode right here. Like that's one of your questions. Like, why did you name it? Why did you name your show, your channel? How did you figure out the calling to your the calling to my channel? I read that. How did you figure out how to call your channel what you call your channel? But conversations, it's just like, it's kind of cheesy, but it's a tonal place, and certain things can work in this space that can work on things that work on Twitter can't work in this space. Certain sorts of personalities, they just fizzle out, or talking points, or personas, or like spiels. You can see the spiel. Some people arrive on my channel with the spiel. And the fun part is like, okay, this is going to take an hour and a half, but I'm going to get to the end of your spiel to the good part, to the But it's like some people are the really thick Tootsie Pop that show up.
That's so true. Well, and it's a skill too, like being able to, I noticed on my channel, it took a long time before I could speak just naturally, like like myself. And I'm like, why is this so hard to just like be myself on camera? Yeah. And I think the same thing is kind of true with podcasting. You kind of have to learn, how do you relax? Because you do need a filter. Like you can't talk about people or gossip, but there has to be a filter that's a little different.
That's why I put my last episode private, because I have to go back and make sure I didn't let a filter slip out of place a little bit.
Yeah. So it does take some practice, but I wish there were ways more people could participate without the high risk of putting it out in public, but maybe like, okay, I'm going to record something and maybe it's just for my friends, and we're going to be trying to sort through things, and we're going to demonstrate, we're going to practice relationship. Yeah,
there's something about the recording of it. You're right. There's like an electricity or this voltage that's turned up a little bit with just that red light on,
Yes.
And then there's also like the Like in Twitter and then Clubhouse, there's just like, there's non-recorded spaces, and then they introduced the recorded function later on, but there's just broadcast. It's just like a chat call, you know, it's just like a live chat kind of thing. That was pretty interesting for a while. But then it gets taken over by grievance culture pretty quick. It's really hard to sustain. And then the bloviators eventually win the day with live conversations.
Who are bloviators? What's that?
Yeah, when you bloviate, you just like the sound of your own voice. You kind of just dominate the conversation and like, okay, well, they're in the room. They're going to do all the talking, you know, and you're not necessarily interested in monologue in a dialogical space, you know? So it's kind of interesting how there's only so much certain people you need. But
yeah, I think that's why there needs to be like some kind of feedback, because nobody likes the person who just dominates. And, you know, there's also like attitudes where that attitude is just destructive of human connection. But I think a lot of people aren't aware of that. You know, if you start a book group, how do you manage it when somebody's like that? And it's just like we've lost the skill set to do this.
Yeah.
And I think seeing it done well helps a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting. My wife runs these group chats, and she wants me to host one. I'm like, I do one-on-one. I don't want to do a group chat because I don't know how to. I don't want to be the one to moderate. But if you think about it, you're like, it's actually kind of natural as long as you like open with like the intention. Like, okay, listen, if somebody goes over time, certain personalities are like that. Just be aware that it's nothing personal, but I'm going to move the mic to someone else, right? Or even teaching a class on how to conversate, you know, could be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's very skill-based. That building up the skills to lead like that is, it takes time, and it takes seeing it done well. How do you handle that situation?
Have you thought about doing interviews? You have a natural listening stance. Like your nature is, I've seen it throughout the conversation where you just go into like listening. And that's why I've talked so much. You're almost as good as listener as I am. Actually, you dominated me inversely by listening so much. So have you thought about doing interviews on your channel? Because that might be a great vector of cross-pollination for you.
I haven't thought about it, mainly because I mean, so far what I'm doing has sort of taken up all my time. Although I love this. I mean, I love this kind of stuff. So I don't know. You put the thought in my mind.
Yeah. Or do you have a friend and you can do a live stream every once in a while? Have you thought about doing that?
Well, like I said, I do private podcasts.
Yeah.
We totally talk about things that I would never talk about publicly. But like if I did,
this is the good stuff. You're really good. You haven't revealed, I don't think, anything that you don't want revealed on my show.
Think
but
so.
Yeah, you're really good at your filtering.
Yeah.
You're compartmentalized, like a professional.
Thank you. This has been so fun. I love it.
Actually, it's been wonderful. Where can people find you, and what are they going to find when they get there?
The New Enlightenment channel is the stuff that's this is the stuff I care about, I'm passionate about. So just the New Enlightenment with Ashley on YouTube. Yeah, my other channel is just my lectures from class.
Just your lectures from class. What's it called?
I think it's just my name, Ashley Hodgson. Yeah.
Ashley Hodgson.
I don't recommend that channel. It's just, unless you're a student in college trying to learn economics. I mean, it's fine. It's fine. But if you Google game theory, you'll find it.
If we get a chance to have another conversation, we could go deeper into economic theory, because you did say that it is kind of a central concern on a lot of the political culture war stuff. If you dig deep underneath, you're like, there's economic theory here. The communists were originally kind of economic, I guess, and then like if you look at a lot of the strange things that are happening on the so-called right, you're like, you see this Austrian economic program like kind of keep on popping up, like this kind of way of looking at human society. It's just like different, so we didn't get a chance to explore that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that has this element of what I'm doing is the groups are talking past each other, and that group has something to say that actually needs to be said to actually heal things. And that group is sort of over this broad target, but they're not connecting with another group. And so that's kind of my perspective on economic theory.
And healing, that's another topic. Like that seems to be a core concern of yours. Healing and
Mhm.
relationship. It's almost like you are a bona fide female. Like you're very female typical concerns in this world.
Well, thank you.
Well, I'm glad that that's even a compliment. That shows me just how woke you aren't.
Yeah.
Actually, do you have a book coming out, or are there any other than video stuff? You're just video. That's the only thing that people are going to be able to find, except for this secret podcast that might surface at some point someday.
Uh, I mean, I'm writing a book, but it'll be at
Okay,
least a year before that's out. So
it's
yeah.
probably not even a book. It's probably a scholarly monograph, isn't it?
I mean, no, I'm trying to write it in a way that's accessible to the public.
Oh,
It's
okay.
very much paralleling my channel. Like the
Oh,
two of
great.
those really interact with each other
Oh, great.
quite well.
Is there a work in progress title?
The New Enlightenment Paradigm Shifts in Economics, Governance, and Knowledge Systems.
Wow. Is it illustrated? You have a lot of pie charts,
It's not illustrated,
you know,
no.
heat
But
maps.
I wish it were illustrated. I really like the having the medium of like the visuals that go with my videos. It
Yeah.
helps so much.
Yeah.
And when I'm writing the book, I'm like, I'm losing something that's frustrating me that I can't have the visuals.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a brave new world. You can just spit some words into AI and it'll create all sorts of confabulous propaganda for you.
That's a
Or
good word for
aids,
it,
right?
confabulist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Ashley, I'm going to end the recording. Thank you so much for your time. And
Yes.
I'm going to send people over to your channel, links to which are down there in the description. Thank you.
Awesome.
All right, we're done. But I always like to say goodbye after the recording's over. That was wonderful.